What if I told you the most important character in your story is not actually the hero? It's the villain. For many years, the spotlight has been put on heroes like Iron Man, Captain America, but they weren't really given a memorable villain because the hero by themselves were enough to sell the story. Until they realized a hero who's always stronger and always wins is just boring and repetitive. So then came the big bad, Thanos, the one who was finally able to defeat the Avengers. In the medium of anime, it has always been about the big bad, the villain that is connected to every strand of the story, and the one pulling the strings behind all the enemies they have faced up to that point. The big bad is the final boss, and it needs to feel that way. So I've gathered 3 of the biggest threats in anime who have become absolute fan favorites to explain how to properly write perfect big bad villain. But first, this video is sponsored by me. So if you want to support the channel, you can subscribe and maybe follow me on Instagram. I would really appreciate that. Aizen is probably the most well known for playing that big bad villain role because of how well he does it. He's overwhelmingly stronger than everyone, but not just that, he's smarter too. And that makes him so much more threatening. You're not just worrying about his strength, you're worrying about his intellect, and not only that, you're worrying about his overpowered ability. Shoka Suigetsu, which is his perfect hypnosis ability, makes it so that he can control all 5 senses, meaning he can make you believe you've killed him while you've actually just been fighting air or your own allies the whole time. Making the villain overpowered in every single way makes the viewer genuinely worried and think about how is it even possible for the main characters to beat them? It gives you that sense of dread and doom, and that's the kind of feeling you need with a big bad villain. So Aizen isn't technically the final villain in the Bleach story, but I think it's fair enough to say that he counts as a big bad villain because he was in charge of almost 80% of the story. Up to that point, everything was because of him. Everything was part of Aizen's plan. Urahara being framed, part of Aizen's plan. Rukia being arrested was part of Aizen's plan. Ichigo being conceived was part of Aizen's plan. Even you hitting the like button right now was part of Aizen's plan. See, a lot of times writers use genius characters in kind of a cheap way. Kind of a way to cheat the audience by saying that when everything went wrong, it was all according to plan. The mastermind had accounted for all the mess ups that were going to happen, and that was all according to plan. Think Sister Sage from The Boys in Season 4, or even Doctor Strange in Infinity War, where he saw 14,605 outcomes, right? And only one of them they succeeded in beating Thanos. And the one outcome they succeed in beating Thanos is the one where they come up with an elaborate plan to jump him, and Star-Lord ruins it. How does that factor into the one outcome? How was that one, the one where Star-Lord messes it up, Doctor Strange accounted for that too? That one was a pure case of plot convenience, a cheap way for the writers to just say, oh, that was all according to Doctor Strange, prophecy, the thing that he saw in the future. It was all gonna happen like that anyway. But with Aizen, everything actually went according to plan. He reveals he was there every step of the way. Even before Ichigo was born, Aizen had been scheming. And I really, really love that about him. Aizen is impossible to outsmart and nearly impossible to overpower. And what makes other people love him so much is his personality. He has such a big god complex, and it's easy to see why. He comes in and everyone's afraid. Everybody knows that he's better. I mean, he stopped the main character's theme from playing by stopping his sword with one finger. He nonchalantly defeated all the captains in the Karakura Town arc without breaking a sweat. He just shows that he's so much better than everyone, and it's so clear to the audience that this villain, this character of Aizen, truly deserves that title of final boss. He does everything so cool and calm and collected because he has nothing to worry about. He knows he's better. And that's what makes his fight with Ichigo at the very end so powerful. Because when he starts to lose against Ichigo, he starts to get mad. He starts to shout. This is something we have never seen from Aizen before, because this was the only time something didn't go according to plan. He was supposed to be stronger than Ichigo after fusing with the Hogyoku. He underestimated how strong Ichigo truly was, and maybe even overestimated his own power. And that's the one thing that led to his downfall, his overwhelmingly big ego and God complex. The same reason why he fell and lost to Ichigo is pretty much the same reason why he's such a beloved character, is because of how high his ego was and how deserving he was to have such a big ego, because of how truly terrifyingly powerful and smart he was compared to everyone else. To write a villain as good as Aizen, they need to be as much of a mastermind that he is. Everything in the story has to lead up to him, because that's what makes him suit a villain so well. This wasn't a villain who just happened to want to take over the world by whim, and 1 week ago he just decided to start his plan for world domination. This was the devious, thought-out plan of a genius who had been plotting to betray his country for hundreds of years. That is what is deserving of the final villain. Dio is a final villain that was defeated in the first arc and still manages to stay relevant throughout the entire series and in pop culture itself. This is why everyone calls him the generational hater. You cannot get rid of him. He just comes and plays every single main character for each part that comes out. See, JoJo is a unique series where each season isn't necessarily like the next season, because parts are different than seasons. And JoJo's parts all feature an entirely different main character and a different main cast. But every single part is important because, previous characters come back, and the whole story is kind of this legacy battle between the Joestars and Dio. See, Part 1's villain was Dio himself, but after he was defeated, he somehow comes back, and I'll explain how. See, Part 2's villain was Cars and the other Pillarmen, and they're relevant because they were the ones who created the stone mask that turned Dio into a vampire in the first place. In Part 3, Dio comes back again in the form of his Jonathan and Dio's bodies combined, basically. But even though Jotaro defeats Dio once and for all at the end of Part 3, he still is technically related and correlated with all the future villains, and I'll explain how to. In Part 4, Yoshikage Kira got his stand power from the arrow that Dio had distributed. Kira's father was given the arrow by Dio. And Part 5's villain, Diavolo, was the one who gave the arrows to Dio in the first place. Now, I haven't gotten to Part 6 yet, but apparently the villain was Dio's friend. So, and then Part 7, I have no clue. But I'm pretty sure Part 7's villain is also correlated with Dio. So it's this ongoing battle between Dio and the Joestars, where Dio is technically the overarching nemesis, you could say, but even though he doesn't, exist anymore. And I think this is a really interesting take on a final. And I think this is a really interesting take on a final villain. Dio's not technically the final boss anymore because each part is a completely new cast of character. But Dio remains the main thread that connects all the villains to all of the character. He is essentially the centerpiece of the Joestar's Bizarre Adventures, like the JoJo's Bizarre Adventures. And that is what a good big bad villain does. He is the centerpiece that connects everything together. He serves as the direct foil to the main characters. The Joestars couldn't really exist without Dio, and Dio couldn't really exist without the Joestars. It's a relationship that forms the whole basis of the series and the story as a whole. And I couldn't think of a better villain to suit this role than Dio because of how well his personality suits the story. Only someone as petty and vile as Dio could forever hate the Joestar. Dio is pure evil. He terrorized Jonathan and his father, who were both noble and kind men. It was a very clear good versus evil fight. And as the series progresses, the dynamic keeps on changing while still feeling familiar, because Dio has caused a lot of trouble to the Joestar family and will continue to do so. While Dio himself is not a very complicated character, he doesn't really have a crazy backstory to justify his actions. He is just pure evil. He wants to rule the world because why not? He's basically God, right? His stand that's named the world is a reflection of his desire to stand on top of the world. He thinks of himself so highly. He sees everything as his. It's his godly right and his kingly right to claim what is his. He is unredeemable, force of nature, evil villain. And because of his overpowered stand power, which is his ability to stop time for a few seconds, and his insanely high confidence, we expect him to win. We recognize the fact that Dio should be able to defeat all the heroes. But that's not why we love him as a villain. We love him because of his role in the story and his crazy personality. Only Dio could be crazy enough to think to finish his enemy off with a road roller. So he may not be complex, he may not be complicated, but he is not a boring villain by far. He has this aura to him, this crazy confidence and this crazed personality, this ultra high ego, which really suits and fits his dominating personality. It only makes sense that someone as petty and cruel and evil and just crazy as Dio would want to plague the Joestars for eternity. And I think that's what makes him such a powerful villain that suits the Joestars, the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure so perfectly. Now, Full Metal Alchemist has to be objectively one of the best plots that have ever been crafted before. I can't really point out any problems anywhere. I mean, every second was dedicated to pushing the plot forward and building the overall theme of the story. And a story so dedicated to its theme and its plot, of course, would need a perfect villain, and it does have that with Father. And I love Father as a villain, not for his complexity as a character, but because of how he fits the story of Fullmetal so well. He directly answers the question that the story brings up. It's about philosophy and humanity, and it's impossible for me to cover this all in this short video. But essentially, Father is an antagonist who embodies the story's themes of human connection. Again, we have another character who thinks of himself as a god, and as a god, he thinks that he shouldn't have flaws. So he created the homunculi, which are the main antagonist group in the story, each of them being and representing one of the sins, one of the 7 deadly sins, essentially him ridding himself of a sin, ascending human and becoming a god. He becomes emotionally hollow. He wants to transcend into becoming a true god by absorbing the sun so that he could access the gate of truth and, just become the true god. Yet that is the exact reason why he failed. This Fullmetal story is centered around human flaw and how that is what creates humanity. And that in itself is our strength. Father tries to rid himself of any weakness because he believes those flaws are what makes him weak, what makes him ungodly. But in doing so, he lost all purpose in life. He just became an empty shell of a person with no real personality or traits. The main characters of the story are ones who have to accept their true flaws and weaknesses and embrace their humanity, as, Edward gives up his ability to use alchemy at the end of the story, while Father's pursuit of power is actually what made him lose everything in the end. Father, as a character, serves as, the antithesis of Fullmetal's theme and story. He himself is a bland character. As I said, he got rid of all sin. He becomes an empty shell of a person. He has no personality. He's just your typical bland villain that wants to take over the world or become a god, or however you want to put it. He attempts to make himself perfect, essentially, transcending humans, becoming a god. And that itself is what makes him, I feel, the perfect villain for Fullmetal. He himself is what makes the other villains feel so much more interesting, and his lack of a personality is what actually makes the homunculi in the story are essentially supposed to just be representations of his flaws. Yet they grow more as characters and people than he ever did. And those flaws, their individual sins, are what caused them to have moments of growth, while Father is the one who decided to basically skip everything, and in the process is unable to pass truth's test. Father is a very necessary villain to Fullmetal. He may not be the most interesting. There are characters like Scar and Greed. That's exactly why he's needed, because these villains are all humanized in the very end, showcase their moments of weakness. And that is what makes us connect to them even more, which further showcases the whole point of the story and the theme. And it's that these flaws are what makes people human. And that is our strength. That is our ability to connect with one another, with that we can resonate with weakness and we can understand each other's flaws. All the other villains in the story show their human side. Some of them, turn for the better in the end. Some of them don't. But regardless, they all show their humanity, whereas Father doesn't have any. This really shows a big bad villain can really be done in many different ways. Father doesn't steal the show himself, yet he is the centerpiece of everything, and he drives the plot forward, while wrapping the theme together very nicely together in the finale. Theo serves as the big bad overarching antagonist, while being absent for most of the parts, but his presence is still very much felt throughout the show. And Aizen being what most people think of as the big bad villain, someone who is strong, cool, and he's a mastermind. And he serves as the ultimate fight for the protagonist, this invincible god basically, that pulled the strings for many, many years. And the protagonist finally gets to put a stop to this long plan of it. If you want me to help you write your story, I have a community with other dedicated writers, which provides you with a course with many different modules walking you step by step to help you write your story better. And of course, you'll have direct access to me where you can literally write a discussion post, directly DM me, and we're doing Zoom calls where I'll give you live feedback and you can show me anything and I'll give you feedback and answer any questions. If you're interested in that, that's the first link in the description. Click that right now.